We are looking at the family tree of Jesus, and we are at the very root, the very beginning of our tree. And we're going to see a lot of instances where it comes, you're able to see Jesus even in this very beginning. And you'll see that as we look at our Corinthians passages and some others as we begin to tying up the loose ends. So you start in the very beginning of your Bible, and you know what it says. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And he creates things on day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. And as he creates the animals on day 6, each time he says, it is good. Now also on day 6, he forms together some clay in the shape of a person, and that is man. And he breathes into his nostrils the gift of life. And Adam becomes a living being. And he says at that point, it is very good. And then he says it's not good for Adam to be alone. I will make a helpmeet comparable to him. And so he causes Adam to go to sleep. See, preachers do it. God does it too. Causes him to go to sleep, takes a rib, and from that rib he makes Eve. So you have Adam and Eve, and it is very good. We've gotten to Genesis 2. Life is great. Now we get to Genesis chapter 3. And you get to Genesis chapter 3, and you begin reading about covenant. And we don't always cover this covenant as we do other covenants. We talk about the covenant we're under today is the covenant of grace, right? We have grace through Christ who covers our sins, who stands in our place. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. You go to the previous covenant, in Exodus 20 and following is a Mosaic covenant, or the old law, or the covenant of Moses, and you see where the Jews were called to follow all those laws which are there. Adam is given what I call, and this is just Mark talking because I don't know anybody who teaches this necessarily. There's somebody smarter than me who has taught it better than I do, but it's a covenant of perfection. You see, there is one rule, and you have to follow this rule, and if you break this rule, there's no going back. And so today, when you and I sin, we confess. If we're Christians, we confess, and our sins are forgiven, right? 1 John chapter 1, verse 9. Today, in the days of Moses, when a person sinned, Leviticus chapter 1 through 4, they could offer up a blood sacrifice, and that blood sacrifice would cover their sins. Adam had one law to follow, and if he broke that covenant of perfection, he was in trouble. Well, it's an easy covenant to follow. Of all the trees on this entire earth, of all the trees, of all the fruit, of everything else in this entire garden that you have, Adam, your job is to enjoy life. You have authority over everything. You will name everything. You enjoy life. You walk with God at a certain time every day. Have communion with him. There's only one rule. You shall not eat of the tree of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. Avoid that tree that has the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Do not eat of it. And if you do not eat of it, you will live. So, if somebody tells you don't think about pink elephants, what do you think about? Right? And as the nature of people is sometimes, when there's one rule to follow, that's the rule we break, especially when we're spiritually immature. And so one day, Eve is in the garden, and as she's in the garden, she meets the serpent. The serpent begins speaking to her, which I would think would be problem one, right? Snake or whatever this serpent is begins speaking to you, a dragon. That would make me nervous. But the serpent said, did God really tell you that you could not eat of this fruit? Well, she repeats God's command with some modifications, and that's pretty interesting to notice. And then finally, as she finishes that conversation, she decides that she wants to be like God. She sees it. She sees that it looks beautiful. She sees that it looks tasty. And she sees that it will improve her pride that she has in her life, her self-esteem. And because of that, she takes it and eats it. Now, we oftentimes act like Adam is somewhere innocent. But after she eats it, she hands it to her husband next to her, to him, who seems to have been quiet this whole time. and he partakes of it as well. And so when that happens, now the next day, when God appears in the garden to walk with his creation, with Adam and Eve, they're not there. Where have they gone? They're hiding. They have tried to cover their mistakes, fig leaves or the leaves of the garden. By their own works, they try to hide themselves, and it's ineffective. And so God calls them, asks them what they've done, and of course, Adam blames Eve, and of course, Eve blames the serpent, and so now all three stand before God. And as you go through Genesis chapter 3, you begin reading about the curses. The serpent is cursed. Yes, ma'am, you got a question? Okay, what's your question? Right. And the best answer to that question is, I have no idea. What the question is there, is the serpent walking around? You know, is the serpent walking around? If the curse is it's going to have to be on the belly into dust. And, you know, maybe that was more of a common thing if you have a snake walking around, which, you know, is kind of strange. What's the Adam Sandler movie where he's a football player? I know this is the demographic class of that. Anyway, there's one where he's a football player. He's a crazy dude, which he is in every single movie. Well, anyway, he invites the coach over to his house, and they are in Louisiana, and people in Louisiana will eat just about anything. If you can catch it, you'll eat it. You just put enough hot sauce on it. What is it? Water Boy. Okay, everybody, let's notice on camera, she's the one who's watched Water Boy. All right, Water Boy. They go to her house, the mother's house, and they're eating the snake. And Fonzie, Winkler is his name. He, he's trying to figure out whether he really wants this guy on the team enough to eat this part of the snake. And so he asks her, what part of the snake is this? And she says, well, snakes don't have parts, but I reckon this would be the knee. Weird movie. All right. So anyway, you know, and actually, the more you study this, the weirder it gets. The serpent, when you study in the book of Revelation, is a dragon. We have traditionally always called it a snake. If you go in more to the Hebrew stuff, you find all sorts of stuff with the way the nouns are put to what sort of creature and this could be. We just really don't know. I would lean towards Revelation, which would talk about the dragon or a snake sort of creature. But they're lined up. The curse upon the serpent is you're going to be in the dust. You're going to slither on your belly. Your life is going to be absolute misery. Okay? The woman, she receives a curse. The curse is the pain of childbirth. The curse is the desire that she has for her man. The man, his curse is as you work, you're going to sweat, you're going to toil, and no matter how hard you work, when the job is done, you're going to look at what you've done and feel like it's been absolutely worth nothing. In Adam's case, building a garden, you're going to work and garden and garden and garden, and once you're done, you're going to look back and it's full of thorns and thistles and the exact opposite of what you've tried. And so what you see there is a preview of the book of Ecclesiastes. You go through life and you find so much of this life is vanity. So much of this life, is absolutely terrible. But in the middle of all of that, in the middle of that curse where we're kicked out of the garden, where now we're going to live, in a very difficult, very harsh world, there is a glimmer of light. And so look at Genesis chapter 3 in verse 15. And as you look at Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, this is the curse to the woman. He says, well, it's a curse to the woman and to the serpent. I will put enmity between you, that's the serpent, and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. All right? So, interesting, and it is very hard to understand, and we'll see here in a few minutes. Eve spent the rest of her life trying to figure out what this meant. And so, it's interesting that there's a glimmer, but it is through an opaque glass. It's hard to figure out exactly what this means. But the serpent would strike the heel, which would be a very painful wound, but the seed of woman would crush the serpent and would overcome whatever it is that's coming here. And so there is your glimmer. So we start there, and as we continue along, we are having fun. We start chapter 4. Adam has relations with his wife. She becomes pregnant. Can you imagine, if you're the very first pregnant woman, what you're thinking those whole 9 months? You know, that's an interesting thing. Did God tell her what was happening? You're about to have a child. You're going to start feeling this way. The hormones are going to do this. Did she know, or did she just experience that? You know, we're not told a lot of these earlier things. A lot of times people say the biggest question they want to ask is, did Adam and Eve have a belly button? I think a bigger question is, what did Adam and Eve think when Cain was born with a belly button? You know, what happened to my kid, and why did my kid have that in his stomach, you know? All right, so we have Cain. Cain is born, and when Cain is born, notice what the word or name Cain means. As you read there in verse 1, with the help of the Lord, I now have a man. I have now made a man, or acquired a man. Now, this could go a lot of different ways. Way number 1, I've acquired a man. That's Adam's name. Maybe she's thinking Adam was not a very good leader. Now maybe my kid is going to be a better leader. My kid is better than my husband. That would go back to that curse given to the woman, where her desire would be for her husband to transition or change her husband and shape her husband in a certain way. Or it could be going back to Genesis 3:15. She's thinking, okay, from my seed, from my child, Satan will be crushed, and now I have a child, and so Cain is going to grow up and be able to destroy Satan. Now, what was Cain's job? You remember? He was a gardener. What was the job of Cain's daddy? He was a gardener. And so he grew up just like his dad, acted just like his dad, lived in many ways like his dad. Now, the next child, which is born in the very next verse, you have Cain, and now you have Abel. Abel, perhaps prophetically, means a vapor, a passing cloud, which may go through there. And of course, that's what we see. And so as you continue through chapter 4, you see there's Cain and Abel. You see that the time has come to worship. And so they come to offer a sacrifice. And as they come to offer this sacrifice, one is acceptable and one is not. Abel offered a sacrifice of what he worked with, grain. Now we see in Leviticus chapter 2 and chapter 3 that grain oftentimes was sacrificed, offered to God in worship. Now, Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice. He gave the first fruit of his labors, and that was among his sheep. Now, you got a lot of people who read this and they're trying to figure out, okay, what's the implication here? You'll read in Hebrews chapter 11 that by faith, Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice. He did it by faith. And that's not just belief, that's your action on your belief. So he is obeying God in some way that his brother is not. And so many people will point and say, God here is searching for a blood sacrifice because that's us through the generations coming will be saved by blood, not by money, not by possessions, but by blood. First fruit. And our worship needs not just be, I'm going to give God something. Worship's about giving God your best. Well, we don't know exactly. A lot of this stuff in the early chapters of Genesis are hazy. And so Abel is honored by God. Cain is not. And Cain is angry. God comes to Abel, or comes to Cain, and says, why are you angry? Good, things will go well, but your anger is going to cause your destruction. Cain stays with his anger, and he allows that. When you can't let something go, and so what does Cain do? Kills his brother, finds him out in the field, and it was a couple years ago. A couple people told me, that's not in the Bible. And I looked, and you know what? It's rock would have worked, but he killed. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, who receives a curse and is sent away. And so look there in chapter from the ground. Now you're under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. In other words, your job of farming is done. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You'll be a restless wanderer upon the earth. Cain said, that's more than I can deal with. I will be hidden from your presence. I'll be a wanderer, and anybody who finds me will kill me. Now, this is going to be important when we get to Tubal Cain. Verse 15, if anyone kills Cain, he will suffer vengeance 7 times over. So he receives a mark upon him, and he is removed. So now Cain is thrown not only out of the garden, like Adam and Eve, he is thrown away from everybody else, to be made a vagrant, to be made a wanderer for the rest of his Cain has. What you'll notice if you read closely, it's the exact same excuse that Adam and Eve had. And what you see is Cain follows that human line of where things happen generation after generation after generation. If you watch some families, you see where abuse begins, and if it's in this family, it goes to the next, and it goes to the next, and it goes to the next. That can happen with alcoholism, it can happen with drug addiction, it can happen with anger issues. But we inherit those proclivities, those tendencies to act just like our parents. And what you're going to see with Cain is a picture of the worldliness of Adam. And as we run through Adam along, and as it continues these terrible, terrible things. So Cain leaves, and now we begin a genealogy. Now, this is not one. We've got these people right here. Cain has relations with his wife. Verse 17, she's pregnant. She gives birth to Enoch. Okay? And in verse 17, what did Cain do? He built what? Yes, ma'am, Marilyn? It'd be a sister. I mean, if you don't do it from a sister, then you've got major issues, because then we don't all come from Adam and Eve and we don't receive the same promise. He went to a different land. Yeah, these people are reproducing pretty decently. And for us, we're like, that is gross, right? You know, that is not what we want to see, not what we want to think about, or anything like that. But in the early days, especially pre-flood, the genetics would have been so much different, so much more pure. We wouldn't have the issues of the webbed feet. You know, when you have a baby, or when, you know, somebody you know has a baby, you count, make sure there's 10 toes, make sure they're not webbed. Y'all may not do that. Your family's different than mine. But anyway, no, you don't have the incestuous, the issues that come with that you would see that happen, you know, with royal families in Spain or in some areas of rural wherever you might be. And so that's where Cain's wife came from. And that's actually a pretty easy thing to come through as you go through. You'll see Abraham, he's related to Sarah. And we think, man, that's yucky. But that's a lot of how it worked back then. And so that's where Cain's wife came from. I don't know, anybody got another answer? Because if you take it from a different country or you do it some other way and you say Adam is not the first, that there's others, then Genesis 3:15 falls apart and 1 Corinthians 15 falls apart. You begin running into a lot of trouble once you hit the New Testament and you talk about the first Adam, first Christ, and those sort of issues which are there. So it'd be a sister. All right, let me think where we are. Oh, Cain's line. All right, so Cain moves. Remember what his curse was. You shall always be a wanderer. So what's the first thing Cain does? He builds a city. Exact opposite of what God's called him to do. And this is where you're going to see his whole family line and what his whole family line's about. So he goes and builds a city, names it after his son, Enosh. And as you go through, you begin reading about these people. And you got Enoch, Arad, Miquel. Miquel is the father of Methuselah. Methuselah is the father of Lamech. And so as you run through these folks, what you'll notice is their names are almost identical of Seth's line. Now, we haven't had Seth born in our lesson yet, but they're identical to the line of Seth that we're going to run down. They're identical in name and outward appearance, but not by inward appearance. And that's the point being made here. Today, you look at a person, you can't tell by looking at outside that he's a Christian, but you can by looking at the heart. So they go through, and the final point that we get to is the man named Lamech, or Lamech, however you want to say. He introduces polygamy. He has 2 wives, Adah and Zillah, and Adah gives birth to Jabal. And Jabal is the father of all those who have tents and raise livestock. Okay. His brother's name was Jubal. Jubal was the one who came up with the harp and the flute and the lyre, instrument of music. And then Zillah had a son, Tubal-Cain, who is the father of metallurgy. Those who create swords and plows out of bronze, out of iron, and of all the different things which are there. And so the point being made here, Cain's line is not following God, but they're very innovative. They come up with some ideas. They are the leading technology people. When we go down Seth's line, you're not going to see them inventing a lot of things. Most of them are just shepherds. Most of them are very humble as they go along. Cain's line, this is some pretty... As far as it being able to make music, these were the big 3 things that mattered to the Israelites in years around these people. You would want to be known among these people. This would be the popular crew to be around. Now Lamech is angry, and he tells his wives, he says, listen, somebody hurt me, but I absolutely killed them. And then he says, not only would I hurt him 7 receive it back 7 times. Receive it back 7 times. And I'm a lot meaner. So, all right? Because here you see the revenge of, says, Master, how often shall I forgive? 70 times. Of godliness in those 2 spots. You see where that's going? And see how that's working? The reason you have that in Matthew 18. We don't notice it.